Hi guys, my name's Dahlia, this is Novel Idea. I'm going to talk about some books that I recommend in this video. And yeah, I got a comment from someone with the username Brewing Up Books to make a video discussing some of my favorite novels. So that's what I'm doing. I filmed this yesterday, but the first part with the audio got kind of messed up, so I'm combining the two videos. Let's get into the books. So the first book I want to talk about is Richard Wagames's Indian Horse. This novel takes on a really heavy topic. It discusses the residential school system and its lasting impacts on the survivors of this system. If you are unfamiliar with some of Canadian history with respect to the Indigenous school system and the 60s scoop, government officials would go and forcibly remove Indigenous children from their communities and from their homes, and they would force them to attend these federally run schools and they were administered by churches. And so the aim of the residential school system was said to be that it would help Indigenous children integrate more seamlessly into broader society, and that it would help them understand and conform to Christian values and understand the European white Anglo-Saxon community more broadly. The actual clear objective, however, was to eradicate their own culture and their own belief system and instead replace it with Christian values and European tradition. And this lasted from 1980 up until 1996. So it's actually fairly recent Canadian history, and the impacts of the residential school system are very apparent in present day issues with Indigenous people. So Richard Wagames takes this topic on in this book, and he does so in a really honest and candid way. I know that his own life was also riddled by the trauma and the issues that Indigenous people had to face during this time. His own parents were survivors of the residential school system. However, because of the trauma that they endured during that time, they were unable to parent him and his siblings. His parents actually ended up abandoning him and his siblings, which then resulted in Wagames being put up in the foster care system, and eventually he was adopted. So in Indian Horse, the narrator, Saul Indian Horse, his family is also really impacted by the effects of the residential school system, and you can see how this really looms large over the family, since the parents in the book also are survivors of this school system. And in addition to that, the eldest daughter of the family was taken off to go to these schools, and there's this fear and anxiety that ripples through the family where they're really terrified that the two boys that still remain with them will also be taken away and forced to go to these schools. So this ends up happening with Saul's older brother Benjamin, and he is taken to a residential school, manages to escape, and comes back extremely sick with tuberculosis, and shortly thereafter he passes away. Saul is then also taken to a residential school called St. Jerome's in Northern Ontario, and there he witnesses the systematic violence and abuse, which includes things like beatings and rape and sexual violence, and also just general dehumanization of the students that attend these schools. So during his time, he gets sort of taken under the wing by a priest at St. Jerome's who kind of serves as a beacon of light, and he actually introduces him to hockey, which becomes a form of escapism and an outlet for Saul, and he has a very obvious and clear innate talent for hockey. And even though he's younger than the rest of the boys on the team, he is still allowed to play with them because of how skillful and how good of a hockey player he is. Saul slowly kind of rises through the ranks of the Canadian Hockey League, but unfortunately, even in this atmosphere and in this environment, he still encounters a lot of racism that eventually becomes really insurmountable for Saul, and he resigns from his career in hockey. Saul kind of becomes a bit of a drifter, and he takes on various odd physical labor jobs, and he also develops a really serious drinking habit. Given the plot of Indian Horse, clearly it's really heavy, it sounds incredibly bleak, but Wagames manages somehow to create this fine balancing act where even though the topics are heavy and they're dark, He also manages to include these elements in the novel of forgiveness and reconciliation and recovery, and how one has to kind of come to terms with one's own life story, no matter how difficult that story is, to be able to fully recover and move on. Even though this book really does delve into some really serious issues, it also manages to maintain a sort of brightness at the end of it. I definitely recommend this book. The second book I want to talk about is The Day of the Locust by Nathaniel West. So Nathaniel West was a writer that didn't really achieve any critical success during his time alive. However, I think afterwards people came to appreciate his novels much more. In particular, The Day of the Locust, I believe, is his most well-known novel. And Nathaniel West was described by his biographer as being a homicidal driver. Eventually did die from a car accident at the age of 37. Another fun fact about this book is actually the character Homer Simpson is named after a character of the same name, Homer Simpson, in The Day of the Locust. And this book was published in 1939, so it was the same year that John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath was published. So I think during that time it was somewhat eclipsed by John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, but I personally find this book to be a little bit more up my street. It's so quirky, it's such an interesting look at Hollywood, and it's got such an oddball cast of characters. The novel, The Day of the Locust, takes quite a depressing, unflattering, and sardonic look at the underside of Hollywood, and how Hollywood kind of inspires this form of sleaziness and narcissism in those that go there to pursue their dreams of becoming the next big thing in Hollywood. It follows the narrator Todd Hackett, who is a recent grad at Yale University, and he goes over to Hollywood to paint for different movie sets and also help with like costume design. He is there, he becomes infatuated with this aspiring actress named Faye Greener. So this novel is really not very plot heavy. The devil's sort of in the details. It really focuses on the oddball cast of characters, which Todd Hackett says at the beginning of the novel that he is interested in studying those people that come to California to die. I do remember the scenes in this novel being very absurd and having this surreal quality to them, and also just being very perverse and kind of disturbing. So I probably will revisit this book sometime soon and do a more in-depth review, because I recall the writing just being so sort of energetic and the characters being so alluring, but also very disturbing and kind of, you know, vapid and empty in some ways, but also deeply insecure. So I would love to reread this and maybe do a more in-depth review, but I do highly recommend it, and I just remember being so fascinated and loving this book while I was reading it. Okay, the next book I want to mention is Willa Cather, her My Antonia. This follows the narrator Jim Burden, who is an orphan at the beginning of the novel. His parents, I forget how, but they pass away, and then he moves over to Nebraska to live with his grandfather and help him on his farmland. Shortly thereafter, a family from Bohemia, which I believe is modern-day Czech Republic, so this came out, I think, just after World War I. I believe it was published in 1918. Anyway, this family from Bohemia, they move over to Nebraska. Jim becomes fast friends with the eldest daughter of this family. Her name is Antonia, and he teaches her how to learn English, and they quickly become really good friends. I think he's sort of instantly enamored by her willingness and eagerness to learn the language. Antonia's father in the novel, he passes away, and she takes it upon herself to sort of fill his role and take on a lot of the physical labor of keeping up the farm. Afterwards, Jim and his grandparents, I think they move over to town, and Jim sort of acts as a reference for Antonia and saying that she's really a skilled household worker, and he helps her get employment in town, which she then helps, you know, keep her family afloat through the wages that she earns. Jim, he pursues like a formal education and he becomes a lawyer, and he goes back at some point to see Antonia, and she ends up really improving the land that her father had initially purchased. She still lives on the farm, and it's very clear from her physical appearance that she has had years of tough physical labor under her belt, and she also has a large family. I think she has something like 10 children, and in her own way, and in a different way that maybe we kind of understand now, she has her own success story. There are really strong feminist themes that are running through the novel, and in particular in Antonia's character. So she is such an independent woman. She is so resilient. She has this amazing endurance about her. Antonia does end up taking on a lot of those traditional female roles. She becomes, a mother of many children. She takes care of the household, and all the while still kind of helping out and maintaining the farm. And there's a wonderful quote at the end of the novel that really kind of exemplifies that. And this is when Todd goes back to visit Antonia after many years of having not seen her. It was no wonder her sons stood tall and straight. She was a rich mine of life, like the founders of early race. Another thing that that Cather is so skillful with is her descriptions of the landscape. There are some absolutely fantastic descriptions of nature, and I think to me she really kind of stands out as being one of the great nature writers. So I'm going to read a tiny little bit from just one little part that kind of gives a sense of how wonderful her writing is when it comes to describing landscape. This is on page 18 of my edition. Where is it? As I looked about me, I felt that the grass was the country, as the water is the sea. The red of the grass made all the great prairie the color of wine stains, or of certain seaweeds when they are first washed up, and there was so much motion in it. The whole country seemed, somehow, to be running. Yeah, so that's just a tiny brief snippet of how wonderful Cather's writing is in terms of describing landscape. And Cather herself has a pretty interesting life story, and I cannot wait to read more of her. This is the fifth recommendation that I have today is W. Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage. This is definitely pretty chunky, but don't be intimidated by the length. It's really immersive, it's really readable, even though it is kind of written in an older style of English. I still found it super approachable. This novel follows the story of Philip Carey throughout his entire life, more or less, and I believe it is pretty heavily autobiographical of Mom's own life. The character Philip in the story is born with a birth defect. He has a club foot, and he's also a very shy individual, and he has a very strong tie to his mother, who then shortly passes away, and then Philip in the book, he has to go and live with his uncle, who is a very religious man and a very stoic, sort of taciturn person. He then goes to boarding school where he is sort of ridiculed for his deformity, and also struggles socially because he is quite a shy and diffident person. Once he graduates, he moves over to, I think, Germany, and I think he starts working there. Then he goes to Paris to try and pursue painting, but finds out that he's not very talented. Eventually he studies medicine, ends up becoming a doctor. One of the main plot points in the book is his relationship with a very toxic person named Mildred. She is a stormy character, and Philip is completely just enamored and enraptured by this person, and it really examines one of the, I think, a really fascinating topic, which is that of unrequited love, and also the act of falling in love and then also becoming disillusioned. You know, how emotional control can take such a toll on your life and how turbulent that can become. She appears time and time again and is sort of taking advantage of him and knows that he has such strong feelings for her that she can always kind of tap into and use to her advantage when she needs it. And eventually, you know, he has to come to the realization that this person is in fact toxic, that his feelings for her are not mutual, and even if they were, that this person is definitely missing an emotional chip and she should not be considered as a potential partner for him. How difficult that process can be of falling in love, and also the act of falling out of love. It really, I think, delves into the idea of being able to let go, recover from your course, and figure out a new way of progressing and moving forward and dealing with whatever life throws at you. This is a really great book. I definitely recommend it, and I don't think anyone should be intimidated by the length. Thanks for watching, as always, and I will see you in the next video. So this is definitely a book that I really want to revisit.